Okay, so you want to make data mean something.
Right.
To humans, but, to computers too.
Exactly.
That's kind of the whole point of this deep dive. We're looking at this book, Semantic Modeling for Data, Avoiding Pitfalls and Breaking Dilemmas.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about how to talk semantics, which, honestly, who wouldn't want that superpower?
It really is about bridging that gap, isn't it, between how us humans understand information and the way computers process it.
Right.
And it's surprisingly, it's not just for data scientists. This is relevant to, pretty much everyone.
I think so, too.
I mean, think about it. We're interacting with semantic models all the time, every day. Searching on Google, using a navigation app.
Right. It's all around us. So is it kind of like we're teaching computers to speak our language?
Yes.
But with a way more precision than we usually use.
Exactly. And this book, really gets into the nitty-gritty of that. Because, one of the biggest challenges is just, simply giving things the right names.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they have this example in the book. They talk about a database where cost, the attribute cost, actually meant construction cost.
Okay.
So, imagine the confusion if you were trying to use that data to analyze, the overall project expenses.
Oh, that'd be a disaster.
Right, a budget nightmare.
It makes you think about all the ways things can go wrong if we aren't super careful about how we define and label things.
Right.
Even from the very beginning.
Yeah, and the book is full of these real-world examples. One that I remember is about a career advice tool it gave, just terrible recommendations, because it didn't really account for the vagueness of the term essential skills.
Oh, that's kind of terrifying.
Right. Makes you wonder how many systems out there are, making decisions based on bad models.
Yeah, that's a bit scary.
Yeah. And the book, it kind of goes into other pitfalls too, ignoring that, the word tall, for example.
Yeah.
It means something different for a person than it does for, a building.
Totally.
Yeah.
So are there solutions? Does the book talk about how to fix these problems?
Yes, it does.
Okay, good.
It really emphasizes that good semantic modeling starts with clear definitions.
Okay.
You'd think it'd be simple, but there's a real art to it.
Right.
It points out common mistakes, like just skipping definitions altogether or using definitions that are either way too vague or way too specific.
So it's like that Goldilocks thing, right?
Yeah.
Got to find that sweet spot.
Yes, exactly.
But, okay, what about words with multiple meanings? I'm thinking of the word bank.
Yeah.
How do you make sure the computer knows if you're talking about, a financial institution or the edge of a river?
That's where the real power of semantic modeling comes in, right?
Okay.
It's not just about, linking words to dictionary definitions. It's about connecting those words to their correct meaning within a specific context.
Okay.
And the book, it gives you some really helpful frameworks to achieve that.
So we're building a model that basically mimics how UBE understand language, but in a way that computers can actually use.
Precisely. It's like creating a map of meaning where every concept is clearly defined and linked to, other concepts in a way that makes sense.
Okay.
But just like with a map, there's different ways to represent the same information.
I bet the book talks about that, the pros and cons of those different approaches.
It does. And it really stresses the importance of making deliberate choices about how you're representing information.
Mm-hmm.
They give this example of the dilemma of whether to represent democracy as a system of government or as an actual country.
Oh, that's a good one. Because you can think of democracy in both ways.
Exactly.
That's an idea, but it's also, used to refer to specific places.
Right, and how you choose to represent that in a semantic model will, completely change how computers use that information.
Yeah. It's all these choices we make early on have consequences later. We're really starting to see how complex this is.
Right.
Even just thinking about the basics. And I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg.
You're absolutely right. The book goes way deeper into things like how to deal with vagueness and ambiguity and the challenges of linking different models together, and even the ethical side of how we represent information.
Wow, okay.
It's a fascinating journey into the heart of meaning itself.
Well, buckle up everyone, because it sounds like we are in for quite a ride. So let's try to get into some of the trickier parts of this semantic modeling stuff. One thing that I thought was interesting in the book was the discussion of false friends. in different languages?
Oh, that's a great example. Yeah, it's so easy to assume that like words that look or sound similar will mean the same thing across different languages,
Right.
but that's often not the case at all.
Right.
They give this great example in the book, the word embarazada in Spanish.
Okay.
It means pregnant, not embarrassed like you might think.
Oh, wow.
So imagine the chaos that could cause in, like a medical database or something.
Oh, yeah, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
It makes you realize that even subtle differences in language can have huge consequences.
Absolutely. And that's, especially important in our world today where everything's so globalized.
Right. It's a good reminder that you can't just assume everyone understands language the same way, even if you're using the same words.
Right. Semantic modeling really forces us to be more precise and intentional about the language we use.
Okay, so we've talked about using clear language, making sure it's unambiguous.
Yeah.
But what about concepts that are inherently, kind of fuzzy? I'm thinking of words like tall or expensive.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to teach a computer to deal with that kind of vagueness?
That's when things get really interesting. The book actually talks about several techniques for handling vagueness. They even have something called fuzzification.
Fuzzification. That sounds like something out of a science fiction movie.
It does, but it's actually a very practical approach. So instead of trying to force a concept into a rigid category, like tall or not tall, fuzzification basically lets you represent degrees of truth.
Oh, yeah.
So you might say this person is tall to a degree of 0.8.
Okay, so this person is pretty tall, but maybe not super tall? That's actually kind of a clever way to represent something that's subjective.
Exactly. And it lets computers reason about vague concepts in a much more nuanced, human-like way.
Okay.
The book has some really cool examples of how fuzzification can actually make models more accurate and useful.
So we're starting to see how all this fits together, how you can really bridge that gap between how we think and how computers process information. But what happens when things go wrong? What are some common pitfalls, things people mess up when they're building these semantic models?
One of the biggest ones, and it's probably the most surprising, is just giving things bad names. It seems so basic, but it happens all the time.
Like using cost when you really mean construction cost.
Exactly. Or using a name for a relation that doesn't really capture the full meaning of what that relation is.
Right.
The book has tons of examples like that, and it's kind of shocking how easily those mistakes, those seemingly little mistakes, can create huge problems later on.
So it's not just about picking the right words.
Right.
It's about using them in a way that's clear and consistent and actually reflects what you mean.
Exactly. And that's where, good documentation becomes super important.
Okay.
The book really emphasizes that. Documenting your decisions, your assumptions, because even if a choice seems totally obvious to you when you're making it, it might not be to someone else.
Right.
Or even to you 6 months down the line.
Right. It's like you need to leave yourself notes to remember what you were thinking.
Exactly. And good documentation can help prevent inconsistencies in the model, It forces you to think through your decisions more carefully.
Right. Speaking of inconsistencies, the book also talks about the challenges of mapping relations across different models, right?
Yes.
Like using owl.same's to say that two things are identical.
Right. Owl.same's, that's a common relation, especially in semantic web languages, to link things across data sets.
Oh.
But the book, it warns that even this seemingly straightforward relation can be misused.
Oh, no, so?
Well, sometimes it's used to link things that are similar but not really truly identical, or things that are only equivalent in a specific context. And this can be a problem because if one model's got flaws, any model that links to it could inherit those flaws.
Oh, yeah, like a domino effect.
Exactly.
If one piece is wrong,
right,
it can mess up the whole system.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to be careful about how you're using those mapping relations and to really validate any data you're pulling in from other sources.
So it's not just about being internally consistent, it's also about making sure your model plays well with others. Okay, so that makes sense. Yeah. Now, there's another area where things can get kind of tricky, and that's with subclasses.
Yeah.
So subclasses, that's like categories within categories, right? Cat being a subclass of mammal.
Exactly. But as simple as that sounds, the book points out some common ways that subclassing is misused in semantic modeling.
Like using it to show part-whole relationships. Like instead of saying engine is part of a car, you say engine is a subclass of car.
Exactly. And that's a logical fallacy.
Right.
The book has several examples of this, and it emphasizes that subclassing should only be used to show, a true hierarchical relationship,
Okay.
where one thing is truly a type of another thing.
It also seems like you could run into trouble when you start mixing up, what are they called, rigid and non-rigid classes?
Yes.
So a rigid class, like human membership's permanent, right?
Yeah.
But a non-rigid class student, for example, that can change over time. If you mix those up, I imagine you get some weird stuff happening in your model.
Absolutely, yeah. Like saying that customer is a subclass of both person and organization.
Right. A person's always a person, but an organization might not always be a customer.
Exactly. And, those tiny little errors can have big consequences down the road.
Okay, so we're seeing that even like seemingly basic stuff can be tricky to get right. What about axioms and rules? Those are the logical statements that govern how the model works, right?
That's right. They can be super powerful tools for reasoning and inference.
Yeah.
But they can also, really backfire if they're not well crafted.
Can you give us an example of how that might happen?
Sure. One common mistake is assuming that all hierarchical relationships are transitive.
Okay.
So just because, A is narrower than B and B is narrower than C doesn't mean that A is automatically narrower than C. It depends on what kind of relation you're using.
Oh, okay. So can you give us a concrete example?
Yeah, sure. Like, you could say Amsterdam is part of the Netherlands and Brazil is part of the United Nations, but Amsterdam is definitely not part of the United Nations.
Okay, I see. So it's not just about the logic itself. It's about understanding how that logic applies to the real world.
Exactly. And that's why the book, it really stresses that you have to use these axioms and rules carefully and test them thoroughly. Make sure they're actually behaving the way you expect them to.
Makes sense. So we've talked about all the ways things can go wrong, but how do you even start? How do you make sure you're building the right model in the first place?
That's where model specification and knowledge acquisition come in. And the book actually argues that this is often harder than the technical stuff of actually building the model.
Oh, interesting. So you could have the best technology in the world, but if you're using the wrong model or bad data, it's not going to do you any good.
That's right. And that's why the book really advocates for a user-centered approach to model specification. So, working closely with stakeholders, understanding what their needs and goals are, and what kind of problems they're trying to solve.
So you have to be more than just a tech expert. You also need to be a good communicator and collaborator.
Absolutely. You need to understand the domain you're modeling, and you need to translate those real-world concepts into, something a computer can understand.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So how do you actually get that knowledge that goes into the model? Where does it come from?
It can come from different sources, expert interviews, existing data sets, even text mining. But the book emphasizes that, not all sources are created equal.
Okay.
You have to really evaluate the quality and the relevance and the potential biases of each source.
So you can't just blindly trust any data you find on the internet.
Definitely not. And the book goes into detail about the problems with bad knowledge acquisition, like relying on experts who aren't actually expert, misinterpreting the data you have, even using the wrong tools for the job.
It sounds like there's a real art to knowing how to gather and evaluate information effectively.
There is, and the book gives you some good frameworks and techniques for doing that. For example, it talks about using what are called competency questions.
Competency questions, what are those?
So they're basically questions that help you figure out if your model is capturing the right information.
Okay.
So, you might ask something like, what are the key decisions that this model will be used to support? Or what are the information gaps that we're trying to fill with this model?
Okay, that makes sense. So by asking those questions, you can really define the scope of what you're trying to do.
Exactly. And the book also stresses the importance of being realistic about what's achievable.
Yeah.
You might uncover some needs that are just impossible to meet given the resources you have.
So it's finding that balance between being ambitious but also being practical.
Exactly. And that involves having honest conversations with stakeholders about what trade-offs you might have to make.
Okay, so let's say you've gathered all this knowledge, you've evaluated it, you've got your sources figured out. What's next? How do you actually get that knowledge into the model?
That's where the real work begins.
Okay.
And the book, it really emphasizes the importance of setting clear guidelines for knowledge extraction and using good validation techniques.
I can see how that part could get really messy if you're not careful.
Oh, yeah. And that's why the book spends so much time on, the pitfalls of bad knowledge extraction, using the wrong tools, misinterpreting the data, not paying attention to context. It's all in there.
So it's not just about grabbing whatever information you can find.
No.
It's about being very deliberate about what you put into the model.
Exactly. And that's especially important when you're working with unstructured data sources, like, plain text, where the meaning can be ambiguous or dependent on context.
Right. So you can't just run a text mining algorithm and accept whatever it spits out.
Definitely not. You really need humans involved to interpret the results and, make judgments. The book has some helpful tips for how to do that well.
Okay, so we've talked about how to build the model, how to get the knowledge into it. Now, how do you make sure it's actually a good model? What does the book say about quality management?
It argues that quality management is like an ongoing process that should be part of every step of the way.
So it's not just a final check at the end. You have to be thinking about quality from the very beginning.
Exactly. And it highlights some common pitfalls that can really undermine quality management.
Like what?
Well, one mistake is not linking quality to the specific risks and benefits of the model.
Okay.
If you don't know how the model is going to be used or what could go wrong if it's wrong, you can't really prioritize quality efforts.
Right. It's like trying to hit a target when you don't even know where the bullseye is.
Exactly.
You're just kind of shooting in the dark.
Right. The book gives you a framework for thinking about quality in relation to risk and benefit. And it also stresses the importance of choosing the right metrics.
Okay, because you could be tracking all these metrics that look good on paper.
Right.
But if they're not measuring the things that matter, then it's not really helpful.
Exactly. It cautions against just blindly using generic off-the-shelf metrics. You really need to pick metrics that are specific to your model and its goals.
So it's about being thoughtful, not just going through the motion.
Exactly. And that applies to every part of the semantic modeling process, from the beginning all the way to the end.
Okay, so we've built this high-quality model. It's ready to go. What's next? How do we actually use it?
That's where application comes in. And the book really emphasizes that this is just as important as any other stage.
Oh, yeah.
You could have the most amazing model in the world, but if it's just sitting on a shelf gathering dust, it's not doing anyone any good.
Right. It has to actually be useful in the real world. So what are some of the pitfalls that prevent a model from being used effectively?
One common mistake is assuming that the model is automatically relevant to any application that's in the same domain.
Okay.
Just because a model knows something about a topic doesn't mean it's organized in a way that's actually useful for a specific task.
It's like having a library full of books, but no way to find the specific one you're looking for.
Exactly. And the book has several examples of that, emphasizing that you have to really consider the specific needs of each application and how the model might need to be adapted.
And I imagine entity resolution can also be a major roadblock, especially when you're dealing with things like text.
Oh, absolutely. Entity resolution, that's the process of figuring out which mentions in the text refer to, the same things in the model. And it's really hard, especially when you've got ambiguity and vagueness.
Right, like trying to figure out which John Smith you're talking about.
Exactly.
When there are millions of John Smiths in the world.
Right. And the book goes into a lot of detail about the complexities of entity resolution. What are the common pitfalls, how to improve accuracy. It's a really crucial part of the process.
Yeah, because if you get the entity resolution wrong, you could end up with some pretty messed up results.
Exactly.
Okay, so entity resolution is important. What about semantic relatedness? How do you teach a computer to understand how concepts are related to each other in terms of their meaning?
That's another really tricky one. I mean, humans, we do it kind of intuitively,
Mm-hmm.
but it's hard to explain to a computer.
Right.
So even if two concepts are related in some way, like Java and C++ are both programming languages,
Right.
they might not be related in a way that's actually useful for the task at hand.
So you can't just assume that any relationship is a good relationship. It has to be the right kind of relationship.
Exactly. And the book goes into, a lot of the subtleties of semantic relatedness and gives guidance on how to choose the right measures.
Okay. Like using a measure that just looks at how far apart two concepts are in a hierarchy, but doesn't really understand the nature of the relationship between them.
Right, that's a classic example. The book has several others, and it really emphasizes that choosing the right relatedness measure is crucial for accuracy.
It seems like the book is pushing for a more tailored approach to semantic modeling, rather than just relying on, like, generic solutions.
That's right. It really encourages you to think carefully about which relationships are important for your specific application and, to consider developing custom solutions if you need to.
So it's not just about following a recipe, it's about being creative and adaptable.
Exactly. And that leads us to the broader topics of strategy and organization.
I'm guessing the book argues that those are just as important as the technical stuff.
Absolutely. It says that neglecting strategy and organization can lead to all kinds of problems, even if you have, a perfectly good model from a technical standpoint.
Like what kinds of problems?
Well, one common pitfall is just not having a clear understanding of what the model is for.
Okay.
And how it fits into the bigger picture of what the organization is trying to achieve. If you don't know why you're building the model, it's easy to lose focus.
Yeah, it's like setting off on a journey without knowing where you want to go. You're just going to wander around aimlessly.
Exactly. And the book gives a nice framework for defining a clear strategy, figuring out who the key stakeholders are, what success looks like,
right,
how decisions are going to be made.
Okay. It also seems like there's a danger of underestimating the complexity and the cost of building these models.
Oh, for sure. It's easy to think it's a quick and easy process, but in reality, it can be pretty challenging and expensive. Especially if you're dealing with, a complicated subject or a huge amount of data.
So you need to be realistic about what it's going to take and make sure you have the resources to do it right.
Exactly. And the book also, it cautions against thinking that there's like one right way to build a model. The best approach really depends on the situation.
So again, it's about being adaptable and creative, finding the solution that fits the problem.
Exactly. And that brings us to another point, making sure your team has the right skills.
So what are those key skills? What do you need to be a good semantic modeler?
The book talks about the importance of both technical expertise, so knowing the languages and tools, but also domain expertise, understanding the subject matter you're modeling.
Okay, so you can't just be a tech whiz. You also need to be able to think like an expert in whatever field you're working in.
Exactly. The book also talks about communication and collaboration skills because this is often a team effort.
Makes sense.
So you got to be able to explain things clearly, you got to be able to listen to feedback,
Great.
And you got to be able to work well with other people.
Okay. Now what about breaking dilemmas? What does the book mean by that?
Oh, those are the tricky situations where there's not like a clear-cut right or wrong answer.
Oh, yeah.
The book has a whole section on this, some of the common dilemmas you run into when you're building a model.
Can you give us an example of one of those?
Sure. One that comes up a lot is whether to represent something as a class or an individual.
Oh, okay. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. A class is like a category of things, like person or city.
Okay.
And an individual is a specific instance of a class, like Barack Obama or Paris.
Got it. So how do you decide which way to go?
The book gives you some factors to consider, like whether the thing has instances, whether those instances are meaningful, whether you need to reason about that thing.
You have to really think it through.
Right, exactly. And the book has similar guidance for other dilemmas, like how to represent the same meaning in different ways, what to include and exclude from the model,
right,
and how to balance expressiveness with complexity.
So it sounds like a lot of it comes down to judgment calls.
Yes.
And the best answer is going to depend on the situation.
Absolutely. The book really encourages you to embrace that ambiguity and see those dilemmas not as obstacles, but as opportunities to get creative.
So it's about finding solutions that are both technically sound and also, like, practical.
Precisely. And that kind of brings us back to that dilemma of how to handle vagueness, something we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
The book goes into more depth on this, looking at approaches like fuzzification and what's called contextualization.
You're not trying to get rid of vagueness completely.
Right.
You're just trying to find ways to represent it in a way that makes sense.
Exactly. And it has some really interesting examples of how these approaches can make models more accurate.
Okay, that's cool. Now, what about the dilemma of how much to include in the model? Do you try to be as comprehensive as possible, or do you focus on a smaller, more manageable subset?
Yeah, that's a tough one. The book basically says there's no right answer.
Okay.
It depends on things like what the model's for, the resources you have, how much detail you need.
Right. So it's about finding that sweet spot between being comprehensive and also being concise.
Exactly, and the book gives some helpful guidelines for making that trade-off.
Okay. And what about interlinking with external models? Do you try to connect to everything out there, or do you pick and choose?
Another tricky one. The book, it actually warns against just blindly following the what's called the linked data philosophy.
Oh, okay. So just because you can connect to another model doesn't mean you should.
Exactly. It's really important to evaluate the quality and relevance of any model you're linking to and how well it's governed. And there are risks to interlinking too, like introducing errors or making maintenance a nightmare.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's a powerful tool, but you have to use it wisely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the book gives you a good framework for making those decisions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in terms of these dilemmas. Now let's talk about the final stage in a model's life evolution.
Yeah, semantic models that aren't, static things.
Right.
They need to change over time, to keep up with changes in the world and the data and the needs of the users.
Yeah. So you can't just build it and forget about it. You have to constantly maintain and improve it. What are some of the challenges there?
Well, one challenge is figuring out what to do when the meanings of things change.
Yeah.
As language evolves, words can take on new meanings. And that can be a problem for models, which rely on precise definitions.
Right, it's like using a map from 100 years ago to navigate a modern city. The landmarks might still be there, but everything else could be totally different.
That's a great analogy. And the book explores different ways to deal with what's called semantic drift. Updating definitions, adding new concepts, even splitting existing concepts into more nuanced ones.
It also seems like it would be tricky to manage changes to the model itself. How do you update it without breaking everything that's already using it?
That's where, things like versioning and governance come in.
Okay.
The book really stresses the importance of having a clear process for making changes, communicating those changes to everyone involved, and making sure that the updates are, backward compatible whenever possible.
So it's about finding that balance between being flexible and also being stable.
Exactly. And the book offers some really helpful guidelines for how to do that. Okay, so we've talked about keeping the model up to date.
Yeah.
Now let's look ahead. What about the future of semantic modeling?
Ooh, good question.
What does the book say about where things are headed?
The book ends with some really interesting thoughts about the future of semantic modeling, and it highlights both the challenges and the opportunities that are out there.
Okay, so what's on the horizon? What can we expect?
Well, it argues that semantic modeling is becoming more and more important as we're generating and consuming just massive amounts of data.
Right.
And it predicts that the lines between human understanding and machine understanding are going to keep getting blurrier, with computers being able to, to understand and reason about the world in ways that they just haven't been able to before. That sounds exciting, but also kind of scary at the same time.
It is. But the book stresses that, by understanding the principles of semantic modeling, we can actually help to shape this future in a positive way.
Okay, so it's not about fearing the technology. It's about using it responsibly and thoughtfully.
Precisely. And that's why I think this book is so valuable. It gives you this really comprehensive and insightful overview of the field. It shows you the pitfalls, but it also shows you the potential.
Yeah, it sounds like a must-read for anyone who wants to really understand how to make sense of, the data-driven world that we live in.
I couldn't agree more. It's a fascinating journey into, the core of meaning itself.
Well, that was quite a deep dive.
Yeah.
Really insightful. So what's the biggest takeaway for you? What's the one thing that you really want listeners to remember from all of this?
I'd say it's that the way we model information has huge consequences for how we see the world, for how we build technology.
Right.
It's not just about the data itself, it's about what it means.
Absolutely. And thinking back to all those examples we talked about for the book, about models that were flawed and led to bad decisions.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how many systems out there are just operating on really shaky foundations.
Yeah, it's a scary thought.
It is a bit unsettling.
Yeah.
And it's a good reminder for us to be extra critical of the information that we're given, to really think about the assumptions that are being made behind the scenes.
Exactly. And that's why, understanding semantic modeling, even just the basics, is so important.
Yeah.
It helps us to think more critically about everything we encounter every day.
Okay, so we've covered a lot, but it feels like we barely scratched the surface of this whole topic.
Yeah.
Let's dive a little deeper into some more specific examples and see if we can pull out some actionable insights from the book.
Sounds good to me. I'm ready to keep going.
So earlier we were talking about how even something as simple as choosing the right names for things can have a huge impact in semantic modeling.
Right, because if those names aren't clear, or consistent, it can just lead to all sorts of confusion and misinterpretations. And I remember the book had that great example with DBpedia.
Oh, yeah, the one where they were using the attribute cost, but they actually meant like construction cost when they were referring to buildings.
Exactly. It seems like a small thing, but if someone was using that data to try to figure out the total expenses for a project, they get wildly inaccurate results.
Right.
And it highlights how crucial it is to be specific, to use language that really reflects what you're trying to represent. You can't just assume that everyone's going to interpret it the same way, especially computers.
Right. They're not as good at reading between the lines as we are.
Exactly. And this becomes even more important when you're talking about large, complex models where you've got all these interconnected concepts.
Yeah, it's like one little mistake can snowball into a huge mess.
Right. And the book actually talks a lot about the importance of documentation to help avoid those kinds of errors.
Yeah, because what might seem obvious to you when you're building the model, might not be clear to someone else or even to yourself a few months down the road.
Exactly. It's like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for anyone who needs to, understand or maintain the model later on.
Right. It's like writing yourself notes so you don't forget what you were thinking.
Exactly. Good documentation can save you a lot of headaches. Speaking of headaches, the book also goes into some detail about the challenges of maintaining model quality.
Oh, yeah. That's got to be tough.
Because even with the best intentions, mistakes happen.
Right.
And keeping a model accurate and up to date over time can be a real struggle.
Is there anything that can make that process a little less painful?
The book offers some really practical advice for improving model quality. One of the key things is to establish clear metrics.
Okay, yeah, because otherwise, how do you even know if you're making progress?
Exactly. You need to be able to measure what good looks like so you can track your progress and see where you need to make changes. And it also warns against just using any old metrics.
Because what works for one model might not work for another.
Right. You need to pick metrics that are tailored to the specific characteristics of your model and the goals you're trying to achieve.
So it's about being thoughtful and intentional, not just going through the motion.
Exactly. And that applies to every part of the semantic modeling process from the very beginning to the very end.
The book also talks about that balance between automation and human oversight, right? You can automate some parts of the process, but you still need experts to be involved.
Absolutely. There are definitely ways to automate parts of the process, but you still need humans, to provide context, to make judgments, and to ensure that the model is truly capturing the nuances of whatever domain you're working in.
So it's not about replacing humans with machines. It's about figuring out the best way for them to work together.
Precisely. And the book has some really cool examples of how that can work in practice.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the challenges and best practices for building and maintaining these models, but one thing I'm still curious about is, how are these models actually used in the real world? What are they good for?
That's a great question, and the book actually provides a lot of insight into how these models are being applied across all sorts of different fields.
Oh, cool. Can you give us some specific examples?
Sure. One area where semantic modeling is having a huge impact is in search. When you type a query into Google, you're interacting with a massive semantic model.
Oh, yeah.
One that's been built to understand the relationships between words and concepts.
So it's not just about matching keywords anymore.
Not at all. Google's using semantic modeling to actually try to understand the intent behind your search.
Oh, wow.
So it can give you the most relevant results, even if you don't use the exact same words that are in, the content you're looking for.
That's pretty amazing. What are some other areas where this is being used?
Another big one is knowledge management. Organizations are using these models to organize all of their internal knowledge, which makes it easier for their employees to find the information they need.
So it's like creating this giant web of knowledge that everyone can access and contribute to.
Exactly. And because these models are based on logic and meaning, they can also be used for things like automated reasoning and decision support.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, imagine being able to ask a computer, a complex question like, what are the risks of investing in this particular company?
Right.
And getting a really comprehensive and accurate answer based on all the available data.
That would definitely make things easier.
It would, and that's just one example. As the technology keeps getting better, we can expect to see even more innovative applications.
So the book's not just about where we are now, it's also about where we're going.
Exactly. It dives into some of the big trends and challenges that are shaping the future of this field.
Like,
Well, one of the biggest trends is just the sheer amount of data that's out there. We're generating more and more data all the time, which means we need better tools to make sense of it all.
yeah, that makes sense. What about the challenges? What are some of the things that are holding back progress?
One of the biggest ones is the complexity of the world itself.
Okay.
It's really hard to build models that accurately reflect, all the nuances and ambiguities of human language and knowledge.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, I guess.
Kind of, yeah. And that's why it's so important to be aware of the limitations of these models and to use them thoughtfully and ethically.
Okay, so we've talked about the applications, the trends, the challenges, but I want to bring it back to the book for a minute. What are some of the key takeaways that you think readers will find most valuable?
One of the things that really stood out to me was how much the book emphasized clear thinking and communication. It's not just about knowing the technical stuff, it's about being able to explain your ideas in a way that people can understand.
Yeah, because even the most brilliant model in the world is useless if you can't communicate it to anyone.
Exactly. And the book actually has a lot of practical advice on how to improve those communication skills, both in writing and in presentations. I also really appreciated all the real-world examples they used. It's not just abstract concepts, it's actually showing you how these things are being used, both successfully and unsuccessfully, in real situations.
Yeah, I like that too. It makes it feel a lot more grounded and relatable. Like you can see how these ideas can be applied to solve real problems. You can learn from other people's mistakes.
Exactly. And that discussion of dilemmas was really thought-provoking. The book highlights how there's often more than one way to represent something, and the best choice depends on the context.
Yeah.
It encourages you to think about those trade-offs, and to see those dilemmas as opportunities to get creative rather than obstacles.
So it's not about finding the right answer. It's about finding the best answer for that particular situation.
Exactly. And the book gives you a lot of good guidance on how to navigate those tricky decision points.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of specific points from the book, but what about the bigger picture? What's the overarching message that you think the authors are trying to convey?
I think at its core, the book is about the power of meaning.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that information isn't just data. It's a representation of something that has meaning to humans.
Right. And the way we choose to represent that information can have a huge impact on how it's understood and used.
Exactly. And the book is like a call to action for all of us to be more mindful about how we create, share, and interpret information.
So it's not just about building better models, it's about building a better world.
I think that's a great way to put it.
This has been a great conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about the potential of semantic modeling, but also about the complexities and the challenges. Before we wrap up, what are your thoughts on how our listeners can actually apply all of this to their own work?
That's a great question. I think it depends on whether someone's actually building semantic models or just wants to be more aware of these issues in their daily life.
Okay, let's start with the people who are building models.
Yeah.
What advice would you give them?
If you're already working with semantic models, I'd say go back and look at your models with a critical eye. Use the guidelines in the book to see where you might be able to make improvements.
So kind of like a semantic model audit.
Exactly. Look for things like names that are ambiguous, definitions that are too vague, relationships that are being used inconsistently, and don't be afraid to start over if you need to.
Yeah, sometimes a fresh start is the best way to go.
It can be.
Yeah.
And taking the time to document your decisions, your assumptions, that can really save you headaches later on.
Right. It's not just about making the model understandable to other people. It's about helping yourself remember why you made certain choices.
Exactly. Even if it seems perfectly clear to you now,
Right.
it might not be a year or two from now.
Right.
Good documentation is like a roadmap for your model. Now, for folks who aren't actually building models, I'd say Start paying attention to how information is presented to you in your daily life. Look for ambiguity, vagueness, misleading language, in news articles, marketing materials, even social media posts.
So it's about becoming a more critical consumer of information in general.
Precisely. Ask yourself, who created this information? What are their biases? What assumptions are they making?
Right, because everyone has an agenda.
They do.
Right.
And the more you practice this, the better you'll get at spotting those potential pitfalls and making informed decisions. Another thing that really struck me about the book is how much it emphasized the importance of context.
Oh, yeah.
A model that might be perfectly fine in one situation could be totally useless or even harmful in another.
Right. Data without context is just noise. It's the context that gives it meaning and makes it useful.
Exactly. And the book gives you some good ways to think about context and make sure your models are aligned with the specific needs of the situation.
Okay, so we've talked about being critical, being aware of context. Let's get even more practical. What are some specific questions that listeners can ask themselves when they encounter a model or just a piece of information that seems off?
One of the first questions I always ask is, what are the assumptions behind this? What are the biases of the people who created it? Because even the most sophisticated models are based on assumptions, and it's important to know what those are.
Yeah. Another question I think is important is, what are the potential consequences if this is wrong?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, how could errors or inconsistencies affect real-world decisions and outcomes?
That's a crucial one, because a small error in one context might be a huge deal in another.
Right. And you got to think about the worst case scenarios, not just the best case scenarios.
Exactly. And another question I think is really important is, how was this model validated? What data was used to test it?
Right. Because if it hasn't been rigorously tested, then how do you know if you can trust it?
Exactly. And you can't just take the creator's word for it. You need to see the evidence.
And if they can't show you the evidence,
that's a big red flag. It could mean that the model is flawed or that they're trying to hide something. Another thing to ask is, how is this model being maintained? What are the processes for ensuring its accuracy and relevance over time?
Yeah, because things change. Models can become outdated, especially in fields that are rapidly evolving.
Absolutely. It's like using an old map to navigate a city that's under construction.
Yeah, good analogy.
You might get there eventually, but it's not going to be easy. So it's important to know how a model is being governed and how it's being kept up to date. One thing that was really insightful in the book was the emphasis on using the right tool for the job.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense.
Just because a certain modeling language or a certain tool is popular,
right,
it doesn't mean it's the best choice for your specific needs.
So be pragmatic. Choose the approach that makes the most sense, even if it's not the most trendy one.
Exactly. And the book gives you good guidance on how to evaluate those different tools.
Okay, and one last thing. It seems like there's a real art to figuring out when to use pre-existing models and when to build your own.
Absolutely. It's tempting to just grab a model that's already out there and try to make it work, but that can be a recipe for disaster.
So when is it better to start from scratch?
Sometimes it's the only way to go, especially if you're dealing with, a really specific subject or a set of requirements that are unique to your situation. The book gives you a good way to think about this, considering things like the data you have, the complexity of the domain, your resources. So be strategic, weigh your options, and don't be afraid to get creative. Ultimately, semantic modeling is about finding the best way to represent and reason about information. It's about making meaning explicit and making knowledge actionable.
It's a really powerful way to make sense of the world.
It is, and as the world becomes more and more data-driven, these tools are only going to become more valuable.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, but it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
There's always more to explore. But I think we've given our listeners a good foundation for, thinking critically about semantic modeling and how it impacts their lives.
Yeah, I hope so. Because as we've seen, the way we represent information and the way we reason about it has huge implications for how we understand the world and how we make decisions.
And the more we understand these things, the more informed and empowered we can be.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay, go for it.
We've talked about asking questions, challenging assumptions, being critical. But I think it's also important to remember that we're all learning here. There's always room for improvement. So don't be afraid to experiment, make mistakes, and learn from them. That's how we grow.
I love that. It's a good reminder that this is a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. And it's a journey that we're all on together.
So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep trying to make sense of the world around you.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another adventure in the world of information. Okay, so we've talked about being critical of the information we encounter, thinking about the context of the data or models we use.
Yeah.
What I'm curious about is, like, what happens when we encounter a model that seems flawed, or information that just doesn't sit right with us?
Yeah.
What can listeners DO? What concrete steps can they take?
Well, it's like we were saying earlier, right? Become a semantic detective. One of the first things, one of the most important things is to really question those assumptions, the assumptions behind the information. Like, ask yourself, what are the underlying assumptions here? But also even, what are the biases of the people who created this?
Yeah. It's easy to forget that even the most complex, super sophisticated models are still made by people.
Exactly.
And people have their own perspectives,
Absolutely. And those biases, they can definitely creep into the model, sometimes without us even realizing it. Another really crucial question to ask is, what are the consequences if this thing is wrong? Think about how those errors, those inconsistencies, how they could actually impact decisions and outcomes in the real world.
Yeah, that's a good point, because a small error in one situation might be a huge problem in another.
Exactly. And it's important to think about the worst case scenarios, not just, the most likely ones.
Right. And I think it's also important to ask, how is this model validated? Like, what data was used to test it? How do we know if it's actually accurate?
Oh, for sure. A model that hasn't been rigorously tested, it's like a black box.
Yeah.
You have no idea if you can trust what's coming out of it. Don't just take the creator's word for it. Ask for the evidence. Ask to see how they tested it.
Yeah, and if they can't or won't show you that evidence.
Big red flag. Could be that the model is flawed or that they're trying to hide something.
Right. Okay, and it seems like we should also be thinking about the ongoing maintenance of the model, right? Like, how is this thing being updated? What are the processes to make sure that it stays accurate and relevant over time?
Oh, that's a great point. Because even the best models, they can become outdated, especially in fields that are constantly changing.
Yeah, like trying to use a map that's like 10 years old to get around a city that's in the middle of major construction.
Right.
You might get there, but it's going to be a lot harder than it needs to be.
Exactly. It's going to be a lot of detours, dead ends, So it's crucial to understand how the model's being governed. What are the steps they're taking to keep it up to date?
It's about transparency and accountability, really.
Absolutely. And that's another key point from the book, the need for more transparency in this whole field. Speaking of transparency, the book also talks about choosing the right tool for the job,
Yeah.
Just because a particular modeling language or tool is like the hot new thing doesn't automatically mean it's the best one for you and what you're trying to do.
So do your research, right? Compare different options. Don't just go with the flow.
Exactly. Be pragmatic. Choose the approach that makes the most sense for your specific situation. And the book actually has some really good guidance on how to evaluate different tools and how to make good decisions. It also seems like there's a real art to figuring out when to use a pre-existing model, one that someone else has built versus when to actually build your own from scratch.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be tempting to just grab a model off the shelf and try to make it fit your needs. But as the book points out, sometimes that can lead to way more problems.
Absolutely.
So when is it better to just start fresh?
Sometimes that's the only way to go, know? Especially if you're dealing with a subject matter that's really specific, or if you have requirements that are, just unique to your situation. The book gives you a good framework for making this decision. It has you consider things like, the data that you have, the complexity of what you're trying to model, the resources that you have available. So be strategic. Really weigh those options and don't be afraid to get creative, Because ultimately, semantic modeling is about finding that most effective way to represent information and to reason about it. It's about making meaning explicit and making knowledge actionable.
It's a really powerful set of tools, for helping us understand the world around us.
It is. And as the world keeps getting more data-driven, these tools are only going to become more and more important.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a great conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, and I feel like I've learned so much, but I think it's time to wrap things up.
Yeah.
So to everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into semantic modeling. We hope you found it helpful and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
And remember, the power to make information meaningful, that's in all of our hands. So go out there, be curious, keep asking questions, and keep learning. Until next time, keep exploring the fascinating world of information.